It's great to be joined today by Brendan Playford, who is CEO and co-founder of Constellation Labs. They are doing some very, very interesting work, which we're going to talk to Brendan about today. So tell me a little bit about the organization, Brendan.
Yeah, so myself and my co-founder Wyatt, who's CTO of Constellation Labs, we started working together on Constellation just over a little over a year ago, actually, and we came out with a vision for creating a horizontally scalable sort of distributed operating system, which would take a lot of the unsolved problems that we currently see in synchronous blockchains and create a solution. So we identified a few kind of core things that we realized were solvable using sort of existing distributed computing technology that was out there, like Spark, and you've also got SETI, which is run by NASA. They do a lot of actual kind of distributed computing jobs or machine learning jobs, and wanted to apply that same sort of methodology to the blockchain space to solve a lot of the well-known scaling issues that we see at the moment.
And for people who may not be familiar with some of those scaling issues that are happening in blockchain, can you talk about sort of what they are? I mean, people may be sort of passingly aware about some of the issues that are going on in terms of fees on some platforms and in terms of transaction scalability on other platforms. But what are those problems that you're looking at?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And when you actually look at the space today compared to what we saw last year, if you look back to the sort of the status ICO, which ended up having a significant amount of transactions being put on the Ethereum blockchain, with fees being elevated, whereby people that were bidding the most amount of gas, maybe like $6,000 for a transaction, were actually kind of put to the front of the queue. That, in a real sense, kind of really exposed some of the limitations of blockchain technology. And over the last 7 years, since sort of Bitcoin's inception, we've seen a growth of users, which has pushed the limits of synchronous technology. So where Bitcoin has a replication of its ledger across every single node, and the same with Ethereum, that provides a very, very secure and robust framework for storing value, which has been a great starting point. But as you move forward to adopting more users and trying to actually leverage this distributed network in a way that is more akin to building applications and dApps, it really kind of grinds to a halt. And the main reason why that is because the transaction throughput is limited by the number of blocks that are being mined. So in Bitcoin, if you want to actually put through multiple transactions per second, that is very limited because every single node on the network has to become updated to maintain that state. And with Ethereum, you're looking about sort of 14 or 15 transactions per second, which is sustainable on that network. Bitcoin, it's significantly lower. And further, being able to take those full nodes that have the entire chain hosted and maybe kind of like spread that across a network where you're maybe using mobile phones or smaller devices, it actually makes that very, very difficult to do so because you can't store an entire blockchain on a small device. And that creates some like pretty severe limitations in the actual technology, slows the network down, and means that actually building consumer-ready, like enterprise-grade applications in a distributed manner is virtually impossible at the moment.
And is this, I mean, bigger picture, when you read the articles about the adoption of any particular cryptocurrency or cryptocurrency more generally, there's discussions about, the sort of number of users that are on the platform. The fees are a big issue. Is this sort of what you see the systemic not risk, but the area where we may see limitation to adoption? Is it a technical one or is it a sort of ideological one? The concerns that some people express that cryptocurrency is not backed by a country, for example. And of course, I'm not saying that is or is not a problem, but I'm merely pointing out that for some people, it's something they point out. Do you believe that the limitations to broader adoption will be sort of political, I guess would be the term, or technological?
So again, like that's a really, really great question. I think that exposes a couple of things. What we've seen over the last year with the adoption of cryptocurrencies, I'm not going to say into the mainstream, but more widely, given sort of price rises, we have sort of lost, I think, a little bit of that fundamental, fundamental belief behind, decentralization and why blockchain has kind of, that political angle has slightly got diluted by the hype of what money is to be made in the space. And I think that what we're seeing now is that the limitations are probably not going to be political. The limitations are going to come by the fact that people coming onto these networks are going to find that their expectations are not met. So when you come to Bitcoin, you expect to be able to do, low cost transactions where you own your wallet and you have all the power, which, that is a political thing. And that's an incredibly important part of decentralization, not to go down that rabbit hole. But people's expectations are not going to be met when they kind of have this technology sold. And when they come and actually use it, they're either paying $30, $20 for a transaction fee on Bitcoin, as it was in sort of November, December last year, or finding that they're actually not able to use a distributed application in the case of CryptoKitties, where that sort of manages to occupy 11 to 15% of the Ethereum network when it's really kind of being used or adopted. These are tiny, tiny use cases right now with very, very small market penetration. And it's more that people are going to become disappointed and they're going to feel like the promise of the technology is not being fulfilled. And that, I think, is very concerning, in as much as we have to be careful that we don't overpromise and underdeliver, and people do have their expectations managed. And that's very different, I think, to the notion of, is it politically driven? If people are going to be encouraged to take ownership and embrace a decentralized sort of economy or a decentralized way of living, and the ability to own your own property, own your money, then the technology must kind of live up to its promises. And until we build a solution that does that, where you can run a node on your phone, you can run feeless transactions across a huge population and not have those transactions grind to a halt, that's going to slow adoption because people simply aren't going to find it works.
Talk a little bit, and again, ideally in terms that will be sort of understandable by a general audience, your project, if successful, what would be the transactions per second that would be possible? And I'd also love for you to talk a little bit about the reputation sort of system that is part of your white paper.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So with our scaling characteristics, we set out looking at this notion of, as we've spoken about, the big problem we've got right now is that more people that come to the network, because their state has to be replicated across every node, it's imagine a room full of people where you have to pass the same message to everyone before you can say the next word in the sentence. That is Bitcoin and that is Ethereum. Everybody must have that word in the entire room before you can go on to the next one. That's actually really challenging, and that slows the throughput of that conversation. So you can think of sort of legacy chains as that, generation 1 and generation 2 being Bitcoin and Ethereum. With our chain, it's technically unbounded. So theoretically an infinite kind of throughput. And if you look at some of the other DAG chains, and a DAG chain is a directed acyclic graph, and that means that there is a different notion of not having every node in the network maintain the entire state. You use a thing called gossip protocol. And again, you can liken this to a room full of people where you start a conversation and that conversation gradually spreads. And if somebody leaves the room and goes to another room, they continue the conversation in there, and gradually that gossip or those messages or that information grows outwardly on the network. And that's what a DAG in the simplest sense is. It's a way of passing messages to other nodes in a linear way where there is a direction on that conversation, and it doesn't require every word to be updated across every single individual. And with our chain, we really kind of focused on the fact that what do we have a common amount of in the world? We have a lot of small devices, a lot of laptops, mobile phones, IoT devices. What if we could make every single one of those devices nodes? What if we could connect every single one of those and put them to some use where their resources and their kind of their bandwidth, their memory, their ability to sign and validate transactions contributed to the overall throughput of the network? You get this horizontally scalable platform. So every single node you bring to the network actually adds capacity rather than sort of takes it away in the sense that it does with other chains. And that was really our starting point, was looking at how existing distributed database and sort of machine learning operations are broken up into bite-sized pieces and spread across many devices to kind of create a parallel transaction pool. How do we do that on blockchain? Then how do we make that secure? So our underlying architecture is this horizontally scalable architecture, which allows for growth in transaction speeds as more people come to the network, they provide more resources. And then we're securing that with a reputation-based consensus or delegate selection model. And that is very, very different to anything you see right now. And we're really trying to make a point of putting that to the front of our message, which is that if you look at Bitcoin, proof of work is very centralized now. It's kind of held with a very core group of miners in either China or Russia or wherever that have built up very, very significant capital in terms of hardware. And then you have other solutions like proof of stake, which again relies on individual wealth that is then concentrated to secure the network. It's sort of your stake in the network means that theoretically you should validate the transactions as true, because if you don't, you stand to lose your money, right? Like that's the crux of proof of stake. So proof of meme, as we've called it, and if you look at Richard Dawkins' sort of thesis on like a viral disease, what behavior benefits a living organism in an ecosystem is good behavior or behavior that benefits the population as a whole. That's why we call it proof of meme. And what it is, it's a reputation system whereby we measure a node sort of behavior and kind of addition of resources into our network, and that makes you eligible for selection as a delegate. And we use a couple of novel machine learning algorithms, a piece of work called Guru, which I'd encourage anyone to go out and read. It's cited in our paper, regret, and temporal PageRank from Google, which allows us to basically shard delegates and achieve a higher than Byzantine fault tolerance on our network. So it avoids collusion and the potential for Byzantine takeover on our network, which, if that wasn't in place, would be actually possible. So by sharding reputation, you end up with kind of clustering nodes to then validate transactions on our network. And it's very unique.
How far along is this entire project?
Yeah, so we started actually the formal process of writing this from a research perspective last year. My background is in physics. I studied in London, and my co-founder Wyatt did maths and physics and then worked at NASA actually for SETI. A lot of our work is really deeply infused in research. And we go through a research cycle and then a commercialization cycle. We have two components, two sort of core teams in the business. Wyatt leads our research and development, and then we have a VP of engineering that sort of leads our commercialization of the actual technology. So last year was very much focused on building the academic underlying framework of our protocol. And in January, we started going full bore on our MVP. And at the moment, we have a fully functioning MVP internally, which we can run as a local network. And that allows us to test scaling characteristics, test our consensus algorithm, and make sure that we're kind of preparing for our testnet launch, which will be in 2 months' time at the end of June, early July. And then we're launching that so as people can come in and actually start working within that and developing apps, or we're bringing in partners to start building alongside us in parallel leading up to our mainnet launch. So we have an MVP. If anyone's interested in getting in touch and sort of working with our dev team, we can invite you into GitHub and show you that sort of architecture. And you can get a node up and running and a cluster of nodes up and running on your sort of local computer and sort of see how that behaves. And then our sort of reputation score will be developed in parallel and tandem to the testnet through summer. And that's going to be open sourced at the same time, so as people can actually see that evolve and be involved in that testing.
And as far as the ICO and the token, what are the stages of the ICO? Where are you there? And what's the utility of the token?
Yeah, that's a great question. So obviously, there's been a lot of change over the last 6 months. We did a private funding round to accredited investors in January, where we raised around 32,000 ETH in January itself. We actually stopped fundraising there and focused on building the business, building the core team, getting our MVP ready, and moving towards our actual testnet. So working with like key hedge funds, partners, and things like that. In tandem to our actual testnet, we think it's really important to create a place in which developers and the community can come in and contribute. So our sort of token use breaks down as two phases. While the testnet is running, We can have an ERC20 token, which token holders will stake in our Orion portal. And what our Orion portal is, it's a user authenticated login where you actually sign when you have a certain number of tokens in your wallet to gain access. And within that portal, you're going to have developer documentation. You'll have access to nodes. If you want to run a node, when we actually get the mainnet up and running, you'll be eligible to be one of the first nodes that goes out on the network to kind of actually validate transactions. There is going to be a toolkit in there and an actual live support desk for helping people kind of get up and running and get themselves off the ground. It's really that sort of ecosystem and sandbox for developers. And we're also going to have a job board where we as Constellation will put up, if anyone wants to do any marketing activities or development work for core components of the architecture, they can do that. But additionally, bringing in partners who would like to have the equivalent of APIs on our network, we call them ACIs, application chain interfaces, where if you wanted to run a 3D rendering pipeline over a cluster of GPU nodes, for example, we have a partner that's going to be doing this. They will put up a GitHub issue. We'll bring in developers into that environment, and there may be a Constellation token or a Bitcoin reward on that job where whoever completes that and then it gets merged to master, they'll get paid out. So the first phase for us is launching that in the middle of May. That's be coming up in about 6 weeks. We're just starting user testing next week of the platform. And if anyone in the community is interested in doing some user testing of that, please get in touch with us. We'd love to have some people dive in and sort of help us through that process of development. And we're looking at doing our token generation event at the end of May. And it's unlikely at this stage we'll do a public sale because of regulatory changes, but we will be doing a limited private sale from mid-May to the end of May, and then releasing the token at the beginning of June. So hopefully that kind of gives some good clarity on that for the community.
Where is the best place for people to learn more about the project?
Yeah, so the best place is if you go to our website, constellationlabs.io, or our Telegram community as well. You'll find that as a link from the website. Jump in there, sort of say hi to us. We're all very, very active in Telegram. We're really responsive. And if you've got any questions, please come and sort of let us know. And when we do things like we may do an airdrop at the end of May for the community, the best place to get informed for that is going to be in our Telegram group.
Brendan Playford, CEO and co-founder of Constellation Labs. Thanks so much for talking to me today.
Thank you very much indeed. I really enjoyed it.